Welcome to Surviving Economic Abuse's banking webinar on economic abuse and banking. So just to take you through the agenda for today, we are going to have quite a lot of and hopefully it will be a really interesting programme for you. So we are going to hear from the Vice Chair of the UK Finance Vulnerability Committee, who's going to just set out the work that UK Finance has been doing and the national picture. We're going to have an introduction to surviving economic abuse's banking work. We're also going to hear from the banking report findings that we have published. We're also going to hear a little bit more about what we have done with banks and building societies. We're then going to hear from Lloyds Banking Group, who will introduce the work of their specialist domestic and financial abuse team. We will also hear from Jen, who is our banking specialist, who will talk about the work she's been doing with Lloyds Banking Group. We will also hear from a victim survivor today, Natalie, who will talk to us about the real difference that banks and building societies can make in this space. And then last but not least, we will hear from two domestic abuse charities who have been doing amazing work in this space, SafeLives and Refuge. And then finally, we will have a Q&A session to end today's webinar where SafeLives, Refuge and Surviving Economic Abuse will sit on the panel. So just to have a brief outline of our speakers today, as I said, we have Tim Hawley, Vice Chair of UK Finance's Vulnerability Committee. We've got Dr. Nicola Sharp-Jeff, CEO of Surviving Economic Abuse, Dr. Olamide Adisa, Research Fellow and Head of Centre of Abuse for Research at the University of Suffolk, Jane Roderick, Head of Customer Vulnerability Strategy and Insight at Lloyds Banking Group, Anita Barnwell, Retail and Customer Vulnerability and part of the Chief Customer Office, Jen Glinsky, who's our banking specialist, Natalie, who's a survivor, Liz Thompson, who's Director of External Relations at SafeLives, Holly Voice, who's part of Strategy and Transformation and specialises at Vulnerability at NatWest, and Ellie Butt, who's Head of Policy and Public Affairs at Refuge. So a huge thank you to all our speakers today for giving up their time to be part of this webinar. And hopefully you will get to learn a lot from them. And if there are any questions for the panel at the end, do pop those in the Q&A. So before we start the webinar formally and hand over to our first speaker, I just want to check in with everyone around self-care. So please do exercise self-care as part of today's session. And if you need any support, please do seek that via the chat function. C Training is the moderator for today's session. And so if you need any support, please contact them directly. We will be using real life examples and case studies throughout today's webinar, so just be mindful that we will be talking about abuse and economic abuse specifically, and that can be really challenging. And sometimes when we hear about economic abuse as a new subject, it can make us reflect on our own experiences or experiences of those close to us. And sometimes we see things in a slightly different light. So please do, if any emotions or feelings come up today, do just take extra care of yourself. If you do need any support, please do refer to Surviving Economic Abuse's resources. We have a resource page on our website, www.survivingeconomicabuse.org. And there are resources that are available there and information on how to access support. If you need to leave the meeting today, you are absolutely welcome to do so. The leave button's in the bottom right-hand corner. And just to make you all aware, a recording will be available after today's session, so you won't miss out. Any questions you have, as I've said, please pop in the Q&A section, and we will get to those hopefully in the panel. And last but not least, if you are someone who's on Twitter or social media, today we are using the hashtag #CWinterWebinars, and you can join our conversation online, and we'll be live tweeting through today's event. So at Surviving Economic Abuse, we really aim to achieve change for women, and we hope to do this over time by working in partnership. And what we want to see is women able to access economic resources, to be in control of these, which is really, really important, to be economically stable, and for any harm that they experience as a result of economic abuse, to be compensated for that harm, and also to be economically equal within society. And how we aim to do this as a charity is through educating communities. So we hope that women and girls can build economic stability and independence. We aim to achieve an increased understanding of economic abuse so that the wider society recognises it and can improve responses to it. We work really hard to improve professional practice, so working with victim survivors, so those who come into contact with them can provide a really adequate and good response. We aim to achieve change in policies and procedures so organisations can understand and remove any barriers that might inadvertently cause economic abuse or might act as a barrier to economic safety. And then we also look to change national laws, so working on both that organisational level and that national level, so that policymakers can reflect an understanding of economic abuse in any decisions they make around policy. So at this stage, I'm just going to hand over to our first speaker, who is Tim Hawley, who's Vice Chair of the UK Finance's Vulnerability Committee, and also who is Head of Customer Vulnerability at Capital One. So Tim, if I could just invite you back to the room.
Hi, and thank you very much, Christina. Welcome to everybody on the call, and thanks for inviting me to come and present at your webinar today. As Christina says, my name's Tim Hawley. I'm the Deputy Chair of the Vulnerability Committee at UK Finance, and I'm also Director of Customer Vulnerability at Capital One. And I wanted to start our talk this morning about what we've been doing as an industry on this really important topic. And so in that context, I think it's worth introducing the role of UK Finance as part of that. So UK Finance is a collective voice for the banking and finance industry, represents more than 250 firms, and it works on behalf of each of those member firms to promote a safe, transparent, and innovative banking and finance industry. It does all of that work through a mixture of research, policy expertise, thought leadership, and advocacy. And if I was to try and sum it up as simply as possible, it's really just a single voice for a diverse and very competitive industry. Now, part of the work is focused on consumer vulnerability, and this is enacted through our Vulnerability Committee and Contact Group, and that has representation from 87 member firms. I, having been part of that for a number of years, would absolutely say it is an active and vocal group. And from the years I've spent as being part of that membership, I think it's effective in driving positive change across our industry. Now, addressing consumer vulnerability has been a key priority for a number of years, so it's also worth reflecting on kind of what brought us all here today. If we cast our mind back to a slightly different time in our lives in 2015, that would feel very different from what we're probably all experiencing this year, our regulator, the Financial Conduct Authority, signalled very clearly its intention and agenda on the topic of vulnerability. And it did that through publication of Occasional Paper 8, which it put out in February of that year. And it's worth noting that that then set in motion a considerable amount of focus and attention on what vulnerability means within our industry and what amendments we all need to make to best support the needs of vulnerable customers. Now, from its early days, the importance and consideration to victims of domestic abuse and the related issues of financial and economic abuse have been part of that ongoing conversation. And it's worth noting that while our industry awaits final guidance due early next year, in the last consultation, our regulator explicitly listed financial abuse within its common harms framework. Now, you'll find a number of organisations who are actively championing this position. Some of them you will hear from directly today, and I think it's great to see Jane Roderick from Lloyds Banking Group sharing some of the fantastic work that they've done in this space. And hopefully that will help everyone on this call to kind of bring to life some of the content and some of the framework that I'm going to set out over the next few minutes. It's important for us to note that change is important, right? And it's only through the dedicated and continued work from many on the call today that we can make meaningful changes that are truly going to impact the lives of those that we're trying to support. I think it's worth highlighting two of the major areas that I've seen during my time as head of customer vulnerability, which I think have massively assisted in this space. The first is simply breaking down the stigma associated to domestic violence, with the hope that more people feel supported in asking for help. The second for me is very much around creating a deeper understanding of the complexities associated to the financial lives of its victims, so that firms such as my own can understand the what and the how of how best to support. I think we've made meaningful progress as a society and within our industry on this topic. Of course, there is always more that can be done, and good intentions alone will never be enough. But that's why I'm proud that through the collaborative partnership from a number of people and organisations, we were able to create something actionable in support of positive change in our industry. Now, in 2018, through the work of UK Finance and many others, we launched the Financial Abuse Code of Practice. 24 brands, large scale, most of them that you'd see on the high street, signed up to this code, and it's a commitment from our industry to being part of the solution and not the problem when it comes to the lives of those suffering from financial abuse. The code has 6 main principles, which you can see on the screen here. And I'm going to briefly highlight those to you today, just to bring to life some of the work that's happening across our industry. So the first principle that the code sets out is about raising awareness and encouraging disclosures. That's about those who choose to trust us can do so confident that they're going to be treated with dignity and respect when they do. The second is a commitment to training of our colleagues. And the purpose of that is so that they can better understand the situations customers may face and provide them with confidence in knowing how they can assist. It's about opening up that dialogue so that we can have a proper conversation. The third main principle is about identification and appropriate response. It's about identifying signals of disclosure, knowing when's the right time to ask questions, to try and help encourage someone to tell us something that we can then use to best support them. And it's about any given situation that that customer is faced, that we can ensure that we support and we definitely don't cause any additional distress. The fourth of the principles highlighted is around minimizing the need to repeat one's story, particularly within the same organization. We recognize the emotional burden that having to repeat yourself multiple times, each and every time you contact a firm, how draining that can be. And so this is a commitment that once you have told us, you should only need to tell us once, and we can use that in context of any future servicing interactions that you have with us. The fifth of our principles is about the important aspect, the outcome that we are trying to drive for everyone, which is helping to regain control of your finances. So it's about how do we provide positive pathways to helping people regain a sense of control over their financial affairs as they start to rebuild their lives. The sixth and final part of our code, which is signposting and referrals, I think then is the part which says we recognize that your financial life is only part of the situation of which you face. And so we must understand where our limitations are, but we still have an obligation to try and make sure that we connect people to great organizations that can do so much more for them above and beyond their financial management and financial affairs. Now that sets out those 6 principles. And as I say, that is a commitment from our industry to helping support and better the lives of those victims. Now, my own organisation signed up to this code, and I saw firsthand the positive difference that made from training all of our customer support staff, both on and offshore, to inviting Nicola to come and speak at an associate all hands event to try and highlight some of the issues that surround this topic, challenging us to make considerations to how we best support our employees who might be having thoughts or concerns related to this topic. And really what I've seen as a consequence of all of that work has been an increase in disclosures so that more people than ever before can be connected to the support that they need. And this relationship continues. It was only last week that SEA came into our organisation to train a specialist team in our fraud department. And they're looking at the overlap of the topic of financial abuse and how that interrelates with things like application and transaction fraud. So it's very much not something that we should see as like once and done. This is just part of an ongoing conversation as we as an industry improve over time. Now, while the code has unified many organisations around a common purpose and approach, it's also created a shared environment of support. It's been much publicised about the concerning impacts expected and experienced during our national lockdowns and other social restrictions. When the Home Office came out and announced it was running a campaign, "You Are Not Alone," 25 brands came forward and stated their support. They did that publicly through many things like Twitter, their own Facebook feeds. And I think that for me is testament to some of the work that we have now started to see as an industry, which goes beyond the code, which I've just talked through. And out of this, the Economic Secretary to the Treasury recognised it and signposted people to the UK Finance It's Your Money leaflet. It's also worth noting in April of this year, there was a COVID-19 financial abuse workshop that was held and attended by Surviving Economic Abuse and also 44 other member firms. And only yesterday, our Vulnerability Committee met to talk about priorities for 2021. And you'll be not surprised to learn that financial abuse was one of those areas members raised in consideration for what we need to do next year. Now, as always, working together and in partnership to find solutions to the challenges we face are going to result in better outcomes for all, and in particular, the victims of financial or economic abuse. And that's why it's great to see so many people attending this webinar today, and I really look forward to seeing what we can achieve in our industry over the years that follow. Christina, thank you so much for inviting me, and thanks for allowing me to talk about this topic and what we are doing as an industry to support. I think it's back to you.
Thank you so much, Tim. It's absolutely great to hear what UK Finance has been up to. And I think for any of us working in this space, we know how influential that code of practice has been and how that's really galvanised the industry to do more in this space, and how important it's also been for victim survivors to see their experiences recognised by industry, and to have, you know, that commitment from UK Finance to take this work forward is so great to hear. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you, and have a great rest of the webinar.
Thank you, Tim. Okay, so with no further ado, I'd like to hand over to Dr. Nicola Sharp-Jeffs, who's the Chief Executive of Surviving Economic Abuse. Nicola's going to provide an introduction to our banking work at Surviving Economic Abuse and set out what we've been up to since that code of practice launched. Thanks, Nick.
Thanks, Christina. And can I just also iterate my thanks to Tim, who's been hugely supportive of our work. And we are really grateful that he spoke today about the work that UK Finance are doing. So as Christina said, I'm just going to talk a little bit about that kind of national context piece. So what's kind of happening in relation to the code of practice that Tim spoke to. But first of all, why do we want to undertake work with banks and building societies? I think it's really important to examine the why we're here today. And it's really because we know that abusers do use joint financial products and systems themselves to control their partner whilst they're in a relationship, but also including post-separation. And banks and building societies really do have an unrivaled ability to address this, to support customers to regain control, have access to the economic resources that they need to be safe, but also take action to address those loopholes that I've just spoken to in relation to systems abuse. So that's, I think, why we're all here today. But also everything that we do at Sea is informed by the needs of victims and survivors. And certainly when the charity was founded, it was very clear from the victims and survivors who were in contact with us that alongside coerced debt, which also does sit within the banking and building society space, although can be broader, the issue of joint financial products and access to an individual bank or building society account are the issues that victim survivors raise with us most regularly. So it's really important that we're doing something that responds to the needs of victims and survivors. And certainly we've been bringing groups of victims and survivors together as part of different roundtable discussions at Lloyds Banking Group, for example, to really talk to teams and understand exactly what's happening so that action can be taken, as I said, to address this issue. So what have we done? Well, we started this work back in 2017 when the charity was founded, as I said, very much driven by the needs of victims and survivors and what they were telling us. And we worked with UK Finance, as Tim mentioned, to help develop that code of practice and to help shape what that looked like. And what we did in December of 2018, after that code was launched in October, was actually held an inaugural Banking on Change conference. So we brought together industry and charities working in this space to explore really how we could support each other in meeting the principles set out within the code, which Tim went through. I think Tim had spoke really well to the issue of customer vulnerability and how that's kind of really grown within the banking industry. And I think that alongside work that government's been doing has provided a fantastic foundation via which we've been able to do this work. So at the same time as there's been a recognition within the customer vulnerability space that economic abuse needs to be addressed, at the same time, the government was consulting on a new domestic abuse legislation, the Domestic Abuse Bill, which is currently going through Parliament. And Refuge saw very early on that it would be really important that economic abuse was recognised in the statutory definition of domestic abuse and would really help facilitate our work in relation to this area. So in early 2019, we were really excited to learn that the government had recognised the need to do this and would be naming economic abuse within the statutory definition of the Domestic Abuse Bill. So as I say, alongside the customer vulnerability piece, a really fantastic momentum had started to build. And as a consequence of that decision by government, the Home Office provided £500,000 worth of funding to support work in this area, because it recognised that once you recognise an issue like economic abuse, then obviously we need to transform responses. So what could we do in addition to the code to really make a difference for victims and survivors as customers? And so we were funded to support the implementation of the UK Finance Code of Practice. So if we move on now into 2020, and I know Olumide is going to speak very much about our work in this area, so I'm not going to go into a huge amount of more detail, but certainly we did a whole portfolio of work, which Olumide will speak to. But one of the exciting things that happened in 2019 was that we trained and supported a specialist domestic and financial abuse team, which was set up by Lloyds Banking Group. And again, I know Jen and Jane from Lloyds Banking Group are going to speak to that in more detail. Also in 2019, we announced the winners of the Best Practice Award for Banks and Building Societies. So that was something that we launched at our inaugural Code of Practice, which is something that we launched at our inaugural conference. And a year later, we were delighted to be able to award that Best Practice Award. And that was really looking at firms who were going above and beyond the principles that were set out in the code. I'm so sorry, my dog's just decided to join the seminar, if you can hear him. Also in 2019, we worked with NatWest Group and SafeLives on the Spotting the Signs campaign, which reached approximately 2.3 million people. So as you can see, in relation to the code, there's been additional activity that's been supporting it. Really delighted to say that, again, we were awarded ongoing funding from the Home Office this year to continue our support in the work of banks. And that also will include the development of an accreditation system. So very much building on the Best Practice Award, and looking to see what firms are doing more systematically in relation to economic abuse across the piece. And then just finally, something that we've also been doing this year is also kind of encouraging the domestic abuse sector more broadly to support around the banking needs of victims and survivors. A lot of this work has been taking place centrally, and it will take a little bit of time to trickle down. It's a big piece of work, and a lot of these groups that we're working with are very big. So it's really important that we can talk to domestic abuse charities about the most effective ways of engaging the banking industry in relation to issues that victims and survivors that they're in contact will have. And so we've been doing a lot of work about how that can be done, kind of the best ways. We have resources around that, which I know we will speak to later. But also just being aware of things that, you know, as an organisation, for example, we can refer directly into the specialist team at Lloyds, for example. In 2020, we also recognised the impact of COVID and provided some refresher training for banks and building societies in relation to that, because I think what became really apparent during the pandemic is that some of those traditional routes to safety aren't possible for some victims and survivors who are still living with an abuser. It's very difficult for them, to find the space and the privacy potentially to call a domestic abuse charity. So actually other spaces became particularly important, and certainly the customer vulnerability space and the ability to call a customer vulnerability team kind of helped create some additional avenues that victims and survivors could follow. And certainly speaking to Lloyds again, but also Monzo, the online bank, we know that calls and disclosure of domestic abuse have gone up in those spaces since COVID. So, this is really important that we're all working together in a coordinated way to ensure that victims and survivors can access safety, in whatever space that looks like. And then really excitingly, and something that we are announcing formally today, a member of the C team has been seconded to the specialist team at Lloyds Banking Group. So I won't say too much about that. As I said, Jane are going to speak to it. But we really see this as a real step forward in terms of ensuring that our expertise and the work that's being done by the bank goes across the group and looks at all those different areas. For example, Tim gave an example of fraud there. There are so many areas that this issue touches, and it's really important that all parts of a bank are working together. And then the last thing I just wanted to draw your attention to is that we've also announced today that we will be piloting the economic abuse evidence form. So one of the things that Tim spoke to in terms of the principles of the code of practice is for victims and survivors only have to tell their story once to be able to receive the support that they need. But what we also know is that victims and survivors will have financial products with more than one bank. So we were thinking, how can we find a system in which victim and survivor can talk about their experience, and then that information can be validated and shared with a number of banks without that victim and survivor having to keep repeating their story. So the economic abuse evidence form, which is supported by the Money and Pension Service, it was a recommendation made to them by a panel of independent experts, will really help us find a mechanism whereby a debt or a money advisor can speak to a victim and survivor, validate their experience within the economic abuse evidence form, and then that is something that can be shared with multiple creditors, for example, and is not something that means that a victim survivor, we know on average, certainly at sea, there will be an average of 5 creditors for victims and survivors who have been coerced into debt, as an example. So it means that they don't have to repeat their story to 5 different creditors. We can find a way of doing that for them. And hopefully that will ensure a consistency of responses across different financial industry, which is really important. So again, just making sure that we're holding the victim and survivor at the centre of the work that we're doing, and what they're telling us and the difficulties they're having is informing the work that we are doing going forward. So a very top line and whistle-stop tour through the work that we're also doing nationally, and delighted to hand back to Christina. Thanks, Christina.
Thanks, Nicola. Really, really helpful overview, and as you say, a bit of a whistle-stop tour through the activity that we've been doing over the past year and a half, really. So again, just because of our packed schedule, I'm now going to invite Dr. Olumide Adisa to speak. Dr. Olumide is a research fellow at the head of Centre for Abuse and Centre for Abuse Research, and also part of the Domestic Abuse Research Network, and she's the lead of that network at the University of Suffolk. So Dr. Olumide Adisa authored our report into our banking work last year, and she's now going to give an overview of the findings.
Thank you so much, Christina. It's really lovely to be here. And also I don't have slides, but I think it's really great to just be here and to actually share with everyone as well. I just wanted to also congratulations to the whole team, to Nicola. Sort of been observing the journey and just the phenomenal work that you guys have been doing. With your partners as well. So that's really been really uplifting to just see how much progress you've made, and just also hearing from about the partnership work that you've been doing as well, both with the banks and also with Money Advice Plus. So I think obviously I'm just going to give some highlights in terms of the evaluation, and also just to talk about the banking element. and also to perhaps offer some reflections in terms of the evaluation itself, just working on that with surviving economic abuse over the last couple of years. And I think it's probably what I liked in that, I think for banks in particular, that they have such a huge, I mean, there's no doubt that they have a huge part to play in relation to the social impact that they can have. I mean, I don't think there's anything we do without having to involve banks in our daily lives. And so in a way, they're already safeguarding money. And I think to incorporate that with just being able to provide support for victims and survivors, I think is just fantastic to see that progression in relation to the impact that it can just have in terms of transforming the lives of victims and survivors generally. Okay, so just obviously a bit of a nutshell in terms of I suppose my own positioning within the work. I do feel like I wanted to say that the surviving economic abuse actually have trained about 363 people through this project, but I will be focusing on the banking aspects, and about 135 professionals were trained. And based on the evaluation, over 80% of those that were trained had not actually previously received training before, which is just phenomenal in terms of being able to offer this sort of product to the banking sector. I think in terms of the training feedback, there were 8 specific outcomes that were captured, which looked obviously at increasing understanding of economic abuse and a host of other outcomes, but it was primarily to upskill professionals in order being able to better respond to customers that might come, they might come in contact to who might actually be affected by domestic abuse. So I think a lot of the evaluation was captured at the end, and just a caveat, I suppose, in a way, as a limitation, because actually, with an evaluation, you probably also want to get a baseline of time point in terms of understanding the distance traveled for those that may have been on the program. However, I think it's important to say that because we know that almost over 80% did not actually receive training, it's perhaps safe to assume that in some ways they're obviously attending training without sort of prior knowledge. And so actually capturing the after effect of the impact of that training is actually something that you could say, you could actually make some reasonable conclusions in terms of the impact it's had on their knowledge and understanding. So I think generally the feedback was very positive, and I think just listening to what Nick has been saying in terms of the work they've been doing, what with Money Advice Plus, they obviously did this really amazing piece of work with, but also with the banks as well. I think that one of the things that really came across very strongly is the commitment from the banks, and I'm sure you'll be hearing about the case studies very soon through Christina and some of the banks that have actually begun to take steps in terms of trying to put in place programs that within their own banks in order to support just not only actually customers, but also their staff who may themselves actually be affected by domestic abuse. So that's something to actually highlight, that this is not only about the customers, but also the staff as well within banks. I think it's one of the things I wanted to highlight as well in terms of the things that worked, where that came out from the evaluation, was actually the having a banking advocate. So Christina's role in particular played a huge role. And I think a lot of the banks that were trained felt that it was really important to feel like they could actually have somebody to actually contact and obviously get support and help. So that was something that we felt from the evaluation that was a key ingredient of success. One of the things that also came across really strongly was also the relationship aspect of it. And I think you can see that even from right from the beginning of this webinar, that relationships have actually been a huge part, parcel of the success story that is actually surviving economic abuse. One of the things I wanted to touch on really, actually I was struck by during the evaluation itself was not just only the relationship building aspect, but actually how it links much more wider into trying to create systems change. within the sector, but also in relation to our responses for domestic abuse. I think that this is something that perhaps I want to highlight really strongly, that this has that this is one of those areas that we've always thought we needed to do something about, and that we needed to carry along with the banks. And I think banks have actually been the banks have actually been part and parcel of the journey with surviving economic abuse. It is quite clear the difference that actually they're already making. And actually through the code, which I know Tim talked about at the beginning, you can actually see that this is something that could actually transform the responses in relation to safeguard, not just safeguarding money, but also safeguarding victims and survivors in relation to economic abuse. I think one of the things I'm just going to say in terms of my own reflections, but both from as an academic, but also just also being part of, in a small way, in the journey for surviving economic abuse, is that there is perhaps no other way to explain the changes that we're seeing besides just saying that working within a very evidence-informed way is more likely to have a longer and a more sustainable impact. And I think one of the things that we can see very clearly, both from the work that's been shared so far, but also from the evaluation, which I think the report is available if you wanted to read more details in it, actually. But just to say that one of the things that's very clear is that it's really very uplifting to see surviving economic abuse working within that evidence-informed way, and also working with their partners in that way as well. And I know I just wanted to congratulate them. I think for me, I think my purpose today is really very always interesting and very refreshing to come onto a webinar and and actually share so much good news. But I think it is very much a good news story, and they should really be all incredibly proud of it. And I think that's where I'm going to stop my own talk today. But I just wanted to say a huge congrats to the team, and also to the partners and the banking partners who have been part of this journey with surviving economic abuse. So over to you, Christian.
Unmute myself first. Thank you so much, Olamide. That was such a helpful overview into the banking work and the report that we've done. I think, yeah, as you say, it's so lovely to be able to share positive news, and I think that's just really a reflection on how, with the backing of UK finance and so much support from industry itself, it's just been so great to see that, and to have that support, and to have firms reaching out and wanting to be trained is always good news for moving this issue forward. So I'm just going to move on at this stage. So we're just having a little bit of a change of order. And so at this point, just due to some speakers, I'm just going to see if Jen might be able to move slightly up the running order, and just giving her that heads up now. So we're just going to hear from Jen. So as Nicola mentioned earlier in today's presentation, Jen has recently been seconded to Lloyds Banking Group, and we're hoping that Lloyds Banking Group will be able to join just afterwards to give that overview of what they have been up to. But in the meantime, I am just going to skip through to Jen's section, and Jen's just going to give an overview of the work that she's been doing within Lloyds Banking Group. Jen, if that's okay, just to invite you on at this stage.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks a lot, Christina. I'll have to try to reverse everything because I was going to build off of what Lloyds were going to say, so that's absolutely fine. So as Christina introduced, no worries at all. My name is Jen Blinsky. I am the banking specialist at Surviving Economic Abuse, and now as you've heard a few times now, I've been recently seconded to Lloyds Banking Group, where I've been working very closely with the domestic and financial abuse team. If I could have the next slide, please. Yes, great. Thank you very much. So I sit within the domestic and financial abuse team, which is a specialist team, which we've already mentioned has been trained by Surviving Economic Abuse last year to take on cases of victim survivors and try to find an appropriate remedy and make sure that we can come up with solutions and more forward thinking about how to best support victim survivors with There we go. How best to support victim survivors. So since I've been in the domestic and financial abuse team, it's been really exciting because it's not just there where I do the work, but it's actually, I've become a bit of a contact across the entire group. So every week, you know, at the end of the week, my line manager kind of asks me, well, where have you been this weekend? And it goes so much further than just the domestic and financial abuse team. Insurance and wealth, fraud, customer financial assistance, all these other teams have since gotten in touch and just said, look, we think we have something for you here. Can you maybe give us some advice or provide a bit of analysis or just kind of help inform the context of what's going on with this victim survivor in order for us to best understand how we can support them going forward. So that's one of my major roles, is really sitting within that team, but then giving advice and analysis to the different teams that have approached me as well. And one of my big roles is to help support the DAFA team to review cases, which go to the escalation panel. And these cases are reviewed on a case-by-case basis. So I look through the evidence that not the customer has given, not the evidence, but their statement, sorry, of what they've said has happened to them. And then I kind of put it into context for the rest of the team to say, look, this person's looking to separate. Money is really, really slim at this point in time, but money is also crucial to allow this person to separate from the abuser. What's the wiggle room? What can we do with the accounts? Or is there anything else that's available to them to kind of assist them along this journey? So it's really kind of about a knowledge exchange. You know, obviously they're experts in banking. I'm bringing the expert knowledge of economic abuse and domestic abuse, but also the customer's journey of where they sit and what happens during the separation process, for example, or as Nicola mentioned, post-separation as well, where we see so many different forms of economic abuse. A further part of my role is to provide training. So it's the surviving economic abuse training, but also one of the good things about sitting within this team is to be able to respond very proactively to any of the needs that different teams have. So for example, training new employees who will be taking the calls on the domestic and financial abuse line to understand, again, what's that customer journey look like? What do you need? One of the most recent trainings that I've given was about having these difficult conversations with victim survivors, looking at perhaps secondary trauma as well, and what it's doing to the employee who's taking those calls. So how can they best support the customer, but then also support themselves and look after themselves when their job is to sit there, you know, sometimes from 8 to 6 and take these really, really difficult calls. Another part of the role is reviewing policies and procedures. And a lot of that has to do with kind of looking at the business as usual approach. You know, what would the business as usual approach demand, or what would we then put into action? And maybe where can we tweak that? You know, is there, again, that wiggle room along these business as usual approaches and something that we can do to, again, help assist the victim survivor a little bit better? Another thing that I spend a lot of time on is doing a development of resources for the different teams. So again, being able to sit in these teams, it really allows you to see what some of the needs are, some of the things that come up that they don't really have access to, or they don't have the time to go and like research and look up. So they come to me and they say, Jen, we don't really understand the legal jargon around domestic abuse. What does it mean when they say this? Or what does it mean when they say, you know, some kind of order has been in place? What does that mean for the customer? Where is the customer on their journey? And then what might we be looking at in the future that they might need assistance with? So it's really these kind of things where I'm able to respond immediately and go, okay, let me take this back to surviving economic abuse if I don't have that knowledge, or I'm able to develop the resources on hand. So another example of that was, for example, the separation process, working again with the employees who take the calls on the domestic and financial abuse line to make sure that they have a really good understanding of the separation process. You know, knowing, for example, that things like refuges cost money, things that the teams are not necessarily familiar with because they're not domestic abuse experts, and we can't really expect them to have this kind of knowledge. So that's where I sit and where I come in to help them just kind of build on the knowledge that they do have and provide these little bits of details that might help, again, their responses to victim survivors. And then another part is assisting with improving banking tools and products. One of the most exciting things I think I've been part of was last week, where another team approached me and said, we're responsible for secure messaging. So, you know, all those little pop-ups that we get when we do online banking or mobile banking. And they're seeing, of course, an increase of people coming to them during COVID, where they're saying, actually, people are talking to us through the bots. They're talking to us through the chat function. How can we make sure that our language is appropriate and that we redirect them to the right resources or get them into the DAFA team? If I could have the next slide, please. So in terms of some of the common themes that I'm seeing whilst working with Lloyds, which has already been just a really short time, But there's some overarching themes that are becoming quite apparent. So as we already mentioned, this coerced debt piece, we're seeing quite a lot of that, of customers coming to us with coerced debt. But it's actually expanding beyond the joint products as well. So we're seeing things where joint accounts are a bit of an issue, as well as credit cards and loans. But what we're discovering is that it's more and more sole accounts and other banking products that aren't necessarily joint, where victim survivors are experiencing the abuse in. So things like taking out a credit card, having to survive on the credit card. All of these things are becoming more and more apparent as I sit within the teams and we're taking these individual cases. So in addition to the coerced debt, there's also we're seeing a lot, no access to control over your accounts. That's sole accounts as well as joint accounts. And just really having complete access removed from you, being given small amounts of money. And sitting in this team, you can actually see, you can see the transactions, you can see what's happening with the accounts, and you go, yes, actually something's going on here. So some of the key features that we're really discovering across the panel, as well as just kind of day to day, is the ex-partner going into an overdraft and then leaving the customer with that overdraft. So again, that coerced debt, whether the customer knew or didn't know, as well as coerced or forced taking loans, being forced or coerced into taking out loans. That's one of the big things. And we see this a lot around economic resources, for example, cars. And that's again, one of those things where bringing the knowledge to, like, actually a car is a huge economic resource. And if that car is taken away, the person might not be able to attend their employment anymore. They might not be able to drop the kids off at school. And how does that then further add to the coercion and the control? And that's what I kind of tried to break down for the different members of staff while I sit on the panel, as well as giving advice when someone approaches me. So we are seeing a lot around economic resources, not just money, but being forced to take out a loan to get an economic resource and then not actually having access to it. In addition to that, we're also seeing a lot of coercion and force being used around credit cards. So we see a lot of the victim survivors coming forward and saying that I'm being forced to use my credit card for survival, not just everyday spending, but also in terms of putting utilities or, for example, rent on the credit card and then having that debt. So these are just some of the key themes that have come across in my time there as of right now. However, I have to say every week is completely different and every case is very unique. So that's been one of the most exciting things about this partnership, is this joint knowledge piece and the knowledge exchange of bringing my awareness and understanding of economic and domestic abuse, but then hearing from the banking specialists about what can actually be done about it and trying to come to a really good outcome for the victim survivors.
Thank you so much, Jen. I think that's such a valuable insight into, what is actually going on within financial institutions and what, financial institutions are hearing from victim survivors. And I think what we know from your brief overview there is that it's a really complex picture, and there's a lot of unpicking that financial services have to do to kind of firstly understand this issue, but then secondly to do the work around it. And that's something which Lloyds Banking Group have obviously taken very seriously, and it's great to have you there and to be able to get that insight on that really granular level into what victims and survivors are experiencing with financial services. So thank you. So just to follow on from that, I'd really like to just invite Natalie as a survivor today to speak about the difference that financial services, and in this case, made to her. And I think that follows on neatly, hearing about that amazing work and knowing that Lloyds Banking Group are already making a difference to customers and victim survivors of economic abuse. So Natalie, could I invite you onto the screen just to give an overview of your experience? And thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. We really, really value it.
Thank you, Christina. Hi, everyone. So I'm Natalie, and I am a survivor of domestic abuse. I fled my ex-perpetrator in 2018 with just the clothes on my back, and he was sentenced to 2 years in prison for controlling and coercive behaviour. In the period when I left, he was arrested and held in remand up until he was sentenced. Now, I openly speak publicly about my experience with controlling and coercive behaviour. The financial side is something that I've just started to talk about, and it is quite emotional for me, so do bear with me. But also, I wasn't ready to talk about it, but now I feel much in a better position to talk. And it's so important that we do talk about the amazing help and support that is available. So some of you might know that I am ambassador for Women's Aid, survivor ambassador, and I'm really proud of that. I did start to explore the debt that I was in when I left and he was held in remand. And I remember visiting my local bank, and I remember having a chat with the bank manager, and he said, "Oh, Natalie, I'm so sorry for your experience, but unfortunately it's only money and there isn't anything that we can do." Now, at that point, I wasn't ready to challenge because my ex-husband was still held in remand and we were still waiting for sentencing. So I was still building myself up and going through quite a stressful, heartbreaking time. So I didn't challenge, but I did keep on. I did keep persevering and keep seeing if what help and support is actually available for us out there in the world of financial and economic abuse. I was also advised to go bankrupt. I was told that's really your only option. And you know, I celebrated a big birthday this year, 21 again, and I wasn't ready to explore going bankrupt at my age. I want to move forward with my journey, and I wanted to be able to save enough money and start putting all the financial abuse behind me and look for my own property. That is something that, you know, I'm still exploring and on that journey. And then just over a year ago, I was advised that Lloyds Banking Group set up a specialist team for domestic abuse, and I was put in contact with them. And I think it's really nice actually listening to Tim speaking about the financial abuse code of practice, and obviously Anita and Jane talking about the work that they are doing at Lloyds Banking Group, because I think I'm going to put the jigsaw together nicely, if that's the right terminology. So the longest part of my journey has been the financial side, because I've had amazing support from Women's Aid, I've had counselling, my health and well-being was put at my top priority. But this little bit of, and it wasn't little, and I'll go into that in a bit more detail, the longest part of the journey is getting the advice and support and getting put through to the right teams that have something in place for survivors of economic and financial abuse. So my case was reviewed by the Lloyds Banking Group specialist team. I was treated with respect, dignity, and believed. And if you speak to any survivor, being believed about something that is so horrendous is so, so important. We spoke in detail about my experience of financial abuse, and I explained my story once, and I can't begin to tell you how important that was. And my story was explained once. I was given a weekly checkup call. I was given a specific telephone number to talk about, to speak to the team, just in case I had any queries or anything else I wanted to follow up. And there was just once that I had a question, and when I phoned, it wasn't the lady that I was speaking to available at that particular time, but that didn't matter because the team knew my experience and my story, and I didn't have to explain it again, because like we know, it is so triggering and re-traumatizing to keep going over and over what your story is. There was a password set up for my account, so at no time could I speak to somebody without giving that particular password that we set up. And I went from having to borrow money from my dad to get to work for diesel, so essential stuff. I didn't have anything when I fled, nothing at all. I was in over £80,000 worth of debt. So for me, to be able to say that Lloyds Banking Group literally, changed my life. I bought a tissue just in case.
No, absolutely. Take your time, Natalie. It's really powerful what you're saying. So just take your time.
There's two occasions where I get upset, and it's if I talk about the local domestic abuse support team and this. So I just wanted to say a massive thank you to Lloyds Banking Group, and also the incredible team at Surviving Economic Abuse, because you have changed my life.
Thank you so much for saying that.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Natalie. I think that's a really, really, really powerful overview, and it's absolutely understandable why that feels emotional. And thank you so much for just joining us today and sharing something that is so personal and so emotive, as I know how challenging that can be. So we absolutely hugely value your time here today and cannot thank you enough. And just thank you for giving that insight into the difference that financial services can make. It's huge, and as you say, you know, just to use your wording, it has changed your life, and that is just so great to hear. And I think that really, like you say, it's the final jigsaw puzzle in today's call, just to really put into place why this work is so important. And if anyone didn't know, I think you've definitely just given it.
Thank you. Yeah, just life-changing for me, and yeah, massive thank you to everyone involved in my case.
Thank you so much, Natalie. Thanks for your time. Okay, so just following on from that, as I think we can all recognise, such a powerful insight into the experience of just the difference that being heard, being believed, you know, having a team that responds with empathy can make to someone who's going through one of the most difficult times of their life. So really, really moving. Thank you. Okay, so just moving on at this stage. So I'd really like to invite Liz Thompson, who's Director of External Relations at SafeLives, and also Holly Boyce, who is part of Strategy and Transformation and specialises in vulnerability at NatWest. So Liz is going to give an overview of the work that SafeLives have been doing in this space around economic abuse, and Holly is going to speak to some of the work that NatWest has been doing as a group. I'll invite you both. Thank you.
Thank you, and thanks to Holly too, and most importantly thanks to Natalie for that really powerful story. It's very hard, I know, to tell anyone about what has happened to you, so I hope you recognise that that will have had a really, really powerful impact on everyone on this call today. Also great to hear from all the previous speakers and the great work that Lloyds Banking Group has been doing, a lot of similar things in our partnership with NatWest, and great to know that the finance sector is taking this so seriously. I just want to say a little bit about SafeLives, and then I'll talk about the partnership work that we've been doing with NatWest. We've got a really big ambition, which I know will be shared by everybody on this webinar, which is to end domestic abuse. This has got to stop, and it's not impossible to say that there are things that we can do to make a really big difference. Our work over the last 15 years has been focused very much on how we can, in our strategy, work to look at the whole person and the whole picture to end domestic abuse, looking at all the needs of somebody. Nobody's just one thing, nobody's just a victim or a survivor, it's all the other things that go to make up who you are. And obviously the central part of our work is how to increase safety for survivors and their families as soon as possible. But we also need to look at the rest of the picture. What about the perpetrator? Why are we asking, why doesn't she leave, when we should be asking, why doesn't he stop? And it's not always women who are the victims, it's not always men who are the perpetrators. We are an organisation for everybody, but we've got to start changing that narrative and putting the focus where it should be, on the person who is causing the harm. We've also got to start looking upstream. Why does this even happen in the first place? How do we look at early intervention and prevention? What are the things that we need to do with young people to build confidence in knowing what's okay and what's not okay, especially around money and finances, something that's not very familiar and not taught very much in schools. And then what do we do to support people in after harm has happened, to live the lives that they actually want to live, not the one that they might have been in, which is not a situation that anyone wants to find themselves in. And how we do that is bringing together data, evidence, practice expertise. We were very early in developing the independent domestic violence advisor and working on the MARAC, the multi-agency risk assessment conference, which looks at support from all elements of society around victims at the highest risk of serious harm or murder, and most crucially, survivors' voice. Natalie's demonstrated why that matters so much, but everything we do has at the heart and start the voice of survivors, because they know they are able to bring their voice to bear on new approaches and new interventions to make the response as good as it possibly can be. And that's what we do in partnership with through training and interventions to give people the best response that they possibly can. A few quick things to say about domestic abuse. Most people are not going to go to the police, and most people don't know what support is out there for them. So that's something that we've got to change. Most people immediately don't really want to talk to somebody about it, and they might not even recognize that it's domestic abuse. But when they do, they seek, I think on average, something like 5 times help before they get the right support that they need. So there's something there that we need to look at. We know that COVID has created a lot of additional pressures. Something like 38% of services that we've spoken to saw an increase in caseloads, and something like 56% of survivors we surveyed told us that they were worried about their finances. We're in a very particular and unique situation, which has just exacerbated everything. In Scotland, we worked recently on the Whole Lives survey, where survivors told us that the thing that would make the biggest difference to their experiences of getting support was better awareness of domestic abuse, particularly understanding about non-physical forms of abuse, whether that's psychological or economic abuse. They told lots of people, but understanding was often lacking. So it's great to hear about the work that Lloyds has been doing, for example, to help that across the piece. To end domestic abuse, we've got to involve the whole of society, haven't we? It's not just the specialist services, of course the police, of course GPs, of course A&E, but also civil society and financial institutions are a really key part of that. We all have a part to play in knowing how to reach in and how to support people. And that's where our partnership with NatWest comes in. They approached us last year after the finance code, the UK finance code that Tim talked about, to ask for our help. And I think we quite quickly realised that there were a lot of ingredients for a really strong partnership. We're UK-wide, we focus on what works, and we have a shared interest in unpacking the system itself. And we work very closely with SEA throughout this work, training customer protection teams to spot the signs of economic abuse, and then looking at policies and procedures, looking at things in the round, really simple ideas like how about offering a video option to get in touch with the banks to prevent impersonation. And then, as Nicola referred to earlier, we worked together to develop the 5 signs of economic abuse for 16 days, highlighting things for people to look out for, people that they, with friends or colleagues that they might be worried about, unusual shopping behaviours, changing work or habits, becoming increasingly isolated, all simple things, but could help you spot somebody who's vulnerable. Again, board level commitment was something that Lloyds talked about, and that is true with NatWest, that Suzanne Jacob, our CEO, presented to the NatWest board as interest in this work grew, and we got a lot of top-down support and recognition that customers and staff might both be vulnerable. What do we do about that? How do we support managers to deal with disclosures? And a new working group was set up to look at how to bring all elements of the bank together to do that. And that resulted, all of that work has resulted, I think, in a 7-fold increase in helping customers with economic abuse issues. From those foundations, we've built the partnership into something deeper with that very real commitment from NatWest. We started having conversations about what more we could do. COVID happened, and then that became much more urgent. And as well as repurposing existing resources and materials and making sure they were distributed as far and wide as we could, the bank made a £1 million donation to SafeLives to support survivors of abuse over the next 3 years, learning from a scheme that had happened in Australia where they'd made small-scale grants for emergencies, for getting safe and building resilience to recover. We've taken slow baby steps to develop the programme because we always want to create stuff in partnership with survivors and services, and we've established some simple principles for the fund. It's UK-wide, it can be available to anybody, but we've got a particular focus on people who might not already be getting support or have particular barriers or needs. We want to spend all the money, get rid of all of the money in 3 years, because we know that need is great, but to do that in as simple and light touch a way as possible. We've talked about how to give the money. So it's distributed through third-party services, and we are going to give people money. We had long conversations about that, but it's really clear that people need autonomy, they want dignity, and they want responsibility in terms of how they might make the most of those funds, and we'll set up a simple evaluation process. We've started work with a pilot scheme with 9 services across the UK. As I say, very slowly, just testing it out. We don't want to launch a huge scheme and then find ourselves swamped with demand, which was what happened in Australia. But the early feedback is incredibly powerful. £500 towards the cost of a car has helped somebody get back into employment. £145 has allowed someone to go to a new specialist refuge, saying, I feel like I can finally heal from my past trauma. Now I'm getting the support that I need. And £235 towards moving costs for someone who said she felt very grateful and excited to be living near family again. And it's, I guess, especially at Christmas, brings us all up with a bit of a shock, really, to realise that such relatively small amounts of money can make an enormous difference to somebody's life. And I think it's a reminder, in terms of what we've learned from the partnership, that there's a massive opportunity for banks to play a role as part of civil society in driving change, and the lessons that we're learning from all our partnership work with NatWest can be fed back into wider policy thinking too, across the finance sector and back into government. I guess the other thing that we've learned has been the benefits are two-way. NatWest, I hope, has learned a lot from us and from SEA, but also we've learned a lot from NatWest and the advice and expertise they've been able to bring to other areas of our work around equalities, for example, around staff wellbeing, which we've really benefited from. And I'll hand over to Holly to talk a little bit about the next steps of some of this work that we're doing together. But I guess would end by saying we've all got a responsibility. We all know somebody, knowingly or not knowingly, that this is happening to or has happened to. And we've all got the ability to make change, to reach in and make a difference to somebody. So thank you for listening, and very happy to talk to anybody further about this work, and hand over to Holly to say a bit more.
Thank you so much, Liz. I think that's such a helpful overview, and particularly understanding the impact that grant that NatWest provided to Save Lives and that's being distributed. To hear the difference that has made is just so powerful. Just knowing that, you know, that's helped someone to start to access specialist support or to access that economic resource of a car in order to get back into employment. And what we know is that in order for survivors to move forward, rebuilding that economic stability, having economic stability is so important to move on from economic abuse. So it's great to see such innovative and exciting work taking place. I'm not exactly sure that Holly is on the webinar at the moment. So just checking, Liz, if there's anything you'd like to add additional, just in Holly's absence.
Yes, I think she is there, but I'm not sure. Yeah, can't quite see her. I would say very briefly then, well, maybe, oh, here she is. Here she is.
No problem at all.
Okay, thanks very much.
Thanks, Liz. I will hand over now to Holly, who is just going to speak about the work that NatWest have been doing. Thanks so much, Holly.
Thanks, Christina, and thanks, Liz. And I think I'd echo all of Liz's thanks for the previous speakers and what we've heard already, because it's hugely inspiring and quite clear that actually individual institutions are only part of the solution as opposed to one. So, I mean, Liz has given a brilliant summary of the work that we're doing together. And I also want to make a special call out to Jen, because Jen did a phenomenal piece of work for us as part of her PhD, which has helped us think about the issue of economic abuse in a very different way too. So I'm just going to draw out 3 of the things that Liz talked about in a little bit more detail. First one is the importance of that bank-wide commitment. So Anita talked about that as well. And I think I've been really surprised, but also delighted by how effective our partnership with Save Lives and surviving economic abuse has been in reaching and enthusing colleagues right across the bank for this subject and for wanting to do something about it, especially teams that might not have considered the issue being relevant to their work, or that they haven't really felt like they've ever come across it before. That commitment from the executive committee, from our CEO, from our board, is really driving the topic and a culture of wanting to do more, to be better, and to learn. And we know we still have more to do, but we really value the support that we get and the help that SafeLives in particular give us when we ask questions or seek advice, and also their willingness to speak up and tell us where they think we could or should be doing more. The second thing is a great example of this is the coercive debt review that we're undertaking internally. So we've brought together colleagues from right across the bank, and there's a real palpable engagement from those teams and a really deep commitment to want to find solutions, both proactive, preventative measures, but also those that help support those people who have been affected. The review at the moment is currently just in the process of really overturning all of those rocks right across the bank to try and look at our processes, our procedures, our interactions, our operations through the lens of coercive debt. And we're starting to see how interconnected the different issues and the different teams are in that sort of process. And we're aiming to report sort of early next year in terms of what actions can we take, what commitments do we want to make in order to do better. And then finally, just to build on what Liz said about the fund. So the fund, as she said, took inspiration from the fund created by National Australia Bank, and we had the huge privilege of speaking to them last year about their approach to domestic and financial abuse and to understand what they'd done. And going away from speaking to them, that was always our ambition. We always wanted to find a way to replicate or to create our own fund. And we started talking to SafeLives last year about it, thinking about how effective and impactful it had been in Australia. So in light of COVID, as Liz said, we really needed to expedite that process. And we recognised that fund could make a real difference in the immediacy. It links closely to the bank's purpose. So we're here to champion people and families, to break down barriers and to support financial confidence and help people regain financial control. And so we also recognise we're not the experts. So we work closely with SafeLives to look at different ways that we might be able to set up the fund, but essentially concluded that we need to create as much space as possible, as Liz said, for experts, for survivors to design the fund that they need. We put very, very, very few restrictions on the fund, only asking that it was as inclusive as possible and really focused on reaching groups or communities or survivors that might traditionally struggle to get the help that they need. And so I think in closing, I don't want to take up too much time, but I would say working with SafeLives on this topic is one of my favourite parts of my job, because as Anita alluded to, the difference that you can make, I think, is really inspiring. And it's small things that make big differences. And I think for us, we're committed to continuing to make both big and small changes to see what more we can do.
Thank you so much, Holly, and thank you so much to Liz as well. I think hearing about work across the industry and knowing that this isn't just happening in one organisation, this is something that's also happening in NatWest, which is a huge banking group, is so exciting to hear. So on that note, I'm just going to now move on so we can hear from another charity who is doing a large amount of work in this space as well. So I'd like to invite Ellie Butt, who is Head of Policy and Public Affairs at Refuge, to speak about some of their work that they have been doing this year with the cooperative bank.
Thanks so much, Christina, and thanks to everyone else that's spoken before as well. My name's Ellie and I'm Head of Policy and Public Affairs at Refuge. And just to start with telling you a little bit about Refuge, we're one of the largest service providers for survivors of violence against women and girls In England, on any given day, we support around 7,000 women, children, and some men through our network of specialist services, which includes refuges, community-based services, and we also run the National Domestic Abuse Helpline, which receives hundreds of calls every day. And we've been working closely with the Cooperative Bank for some time now, and I'll just start with a sort of potted history of our partnership together. So our work started in 2015 when we worked together on the Money Matters campaign, and that work, I say we, but that work then was led by Surviving Economic Abuse's very own Nicola Sharps-Jeffs, who we've heard from today. And the focus of that work was to conduct some research and really understand the prevalence of economic abuse nationally and the impact it was having on survivors. We, of course, knew from our specialist services that economic abuse was a huge issue. It wasn't as well understood as it needed to be, and that it was having a long-term impact on survivors, but we really wanted to work together to develop that evidence base and put forward recommendations for change. So that work in 2015 found that 1 in 5 adults in the UK had experienced economic abuse in a current or former relationship. And I'll share these reports afterwards. It contains a huge wealth of information, but one of the key recommendations from that first piece of work was that there needed to be some kind of code of practice in place for banks and building societies. And it's just so brilliant to hear today from Tim and from others about the impact that code has and continues to have. So earlier this year, we decided that we wanted to do some more research and some more sort of prevalence work together on economic abuse. And there was a number of reasons behind this. You know, firstly, since 2015, lots have changed. And I think we've heard an amazing overview of what that change has been and involved on this webinar today. You know, we have now Surviving Economic Abuse, a specialist charity working on this issue. The code of practice exists. So many major banks have developed their processes and practices. So we wanted to understand, you know, what has changed in terms of prevalence and impact nationally in 2020. And we also saw that the findings from our 2015 report were still being used really widely. So we wanted to make that contribution to the sector and to understanding and think about what more needs to happen. Where do we need to redouble our efforts? What other change do we need to see? So we decided to almost sort of repeat our research and our survey. But firstly, we consulted survivors to get their view on what did they think was missing, what are the key issues for them that they wanted to see us look into. And perhaps unsurprisingly, we've heard about it already, the coerced debt and the long-term impact of debt and the impact on credit ratings was a really key issue. So we expanded our work in that area. So earlier this year, we worked with Opinium, a polling survey company, who surveyed a representative sample of just over 4,000 adults in the UK about their experience of economic abuse and the impact of economic abuse. We also conducted detailed interviews with survivors that were currently accessing refuge services and survivors that had previously accessed refuge services to talk about their experiences of economic abuse in detail. So just to share a few of the headline findings, overall we found 16% of adults in the UK, which is equivalent to 10.5 million people, said that they had experienced economic abuse in a current or a former relationship. However, there was a really big difference when we asked that straightforward question, have you experienced economic abuse in a current or former relationship? And then when we asked about different types of behaviours they'd experienced, different examples of economic abuse that we put to them and asked if they'd had experience of. And when we used the examples, so things like we've heard today about joint accounts that they can or can't access, do they have use of economic resources like cars, things like that, 39% of adults said yes to at least one of those behaviours. So that suggests that while so much work has been done on awareness and education, there's still so much to do there, that lots of people are experiencing economic abuse, but but don't necessarily recognise it as that. And that was supported with some more findings from the research that found that less than a third of the 4,000 people that responded to the survey had heard of the term economic abuse before. There are also findings in the research that probably won't surprise many people on this call, but that economic abuse very rarely exists on its own, and over 85% were experiencing other forms of domestic abuse and this pattern of coercive and controlling behaviour that economic abuse is a part. And like I said, we really wanted to look at debt and the long impact of debt, because that's what survivors were telling us was so important to them. So we found that of those who experienced economic abuse, over 20% said they had debts that they couldn't repay. Of those that responded to the survey, on average, survivors were in debt of around £3,500, although a quarter were in debts of over £5,000. Now, when you scale this up nationally, that's over £14 billion of debt in the UK that's linked to economic abuse. Almost half of the respondents said they were still trying to pay off that debt at the time that they responded to the survey, or that debt was still in their name and still a key challenge for them. And around a quarter that experienced economic abuse had a negatively impacted credit rating, and that was causing really significant long-term challenges for them, including things like difficulty buying or renting a home, only being able to access credit with really high costs, and even homelessness in a significant but a minority of cases. Now, we were all due to publish this work in sort of end of April, early May, but we didn't do that because the pandemic hit and work was paused, and both us and the Cooperative Bank were really focused on supporting the survivors in our services and our customers around the impact of the pandemic. And the Cooperative Bank made a really generous donation to us to help us continue to provide that direct support to survivors over this challenging year. But we didn't pause the work for long, and we thought, yes, we want to publish this soon, but also, what more do we need? We know the impact that COVID-19 is having on survivors of domestic abuse. Calls to the National Domestic Abuse Helpline increased significantly. We know that many people reached out to SafeLives, to Surviving Economic Abuse, lots of other charities. More and more people reached out for support at that time. So we decided to conduct some more research and try and understand the impact COVID-19 was having on survivors of economic abuse. And we found that 1.6 million people, so 3% of all UK adults, said that they first started experiencing economic abuse during the pandemic. Now, of course, the pandemic doesn't cause economic abuse, but what seemed to have been happening, or what our findings suggested, was that the financial changes and challenges people were going through were giving abusers more opportunities to control and coerce by economic abuse. So, for example, 1 in 3 of those who first experienced economic abuse during the pandemic said that when their pay decreased, or when they were furloughed or lost their job as a result of COVID-19, their partner increased financial control or began to financially control them. In terms of banks and we really wanted to know about how many survivors had contacted their banks, the response they got, how they felt about that. And we found that compared to 2015, the numbers that had told somebody about the abuse had increased. So not hugely, but in 2015 we found that just over a third said that they told nobody about the financial abuse, and in 2020 this was a bit less, under a third hadn't told anyone. In terms of banks, it was around the same. So 15% said they'd reached out to their bank or building society for support. But when asked, 24% of respondents said that they didn't think that they could go to their bank for help. They didn't think there'd be any help there for them. So it just shows how important all the work that these big banks are doing is, and how there are still so many more people to reach and let them know what support is there for them. Although interestingly, in contacting banks, the findings are quite different for the pre-COVID research and the kind of during COVID research. Found for those whose economic abuse began to start experiencing economic abuse during the COVID-19 crisis, they were much more likely to tell someone, and they were much more likely to tell their bank. So 29% told their bank, and we've heard from Lloyds about increased disclosures during this time. So I think there's a real opportunity there for banks to understand what enabled their customers to reach out to them at that point, and how they can build on that. Online banking was another really big theme from the research. So 15% said that they found online banking really helpful in helping them get some economic stability, take control over their finances. But a larger number, almost a quarter, 24%, said they thought online banking had made them more vulnerable to their abusive partners and made it easier for them to be monitored. So from this work, we developed a 5-point plan of action, and it really sort of supports all the brilliant work that we've heard about today. So highlighted the importance of joint financial products and banks doing more to create processes that help keep survivors safe, and also inform about the risks of joint financial products and what banks can do to help. Clear processes for customers that are in debt and need to tell their banks about what's happening to them was also raised, and we've heard about the brilliant work that's going on in that area. Credit reference agencies were highlighted, and about that really important need to repair credit ratings damaged as a result of economic abuse. And since the publication of the report, we've been working more closely with Experian to review the current systems in place and assess what changes needed there. And also, really importantly, this online banking issue, it's clearly complicated. It's really helpful in some ways, but it is a hindrance in others. So together, our main focus in this area for 2021 is to review online banking and the role it's playing in terms of helping or limiting survivors in rebuilding their lives free from abuse and achieving economic stability. So we're going to be looking into that in detail next year, and we'll certainly be reaching out to lots of people on this call today to how we can all work together to look at that, because I think a really clear message from today's webinar has been that it's system-wide change we need. This work can be really hard and it can take time, but there's so much goodwill and energy to work on it. So thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Ellie. I think it's just so great to hear that this work isn't just happening in silos, and it's starting to, I think today is part of bringing the industry together and bringing us as domestic abuse charities together to, coordinate the work in this space, and hope to see even more change as we move into 2021. And it's, really exciting and great to see the report and particularly the insights into, experiences during COVID as well. So thank you for that. At this stage, we're just going to move on to have a few questions to the domestic abuse and banking panel. So if I could invite Ellie, Liz and Nicola back onto the screen, and we've just got a couple of questions for you today. So we've heard a lot today about financial abuse, economic abuse, and what the banks and building societies have been up to. As you know, and anyone's welcome to answer to this, and please don't feel pressured, but do we know, are all banks doing this work, or is it just a certain number of banks? People were really excited to hear about the work of Lloyds specialist team and also the work that NatWest has done, but is this the case at all banks, or is it just a few of them? Nicola, I wondered if you might be able to answer that one. Just come in first.
Yeah, absolutely. So the code that Tim spoke to right at the beginning of the webinar, the Code of Practice on Financial Abuse, was signed up to initially by 19 of the main banks and building societies. And certainly I believe that number has now grown to 24. So certainly there is work going on more broadly. Again, as Olumide's overview of the evaluation report showed, surviving economic abuse trained 5 banks and building societies last year, including Lloyds Banking Group and NatWest Group and the Cooperative Bank as well. And for example, we provided training just last week to Nationwide. In addition to Capital One, we've been very busy. So certainly as this issue is growing in momentum, more and more banks are coming and seeking support. And what I would say, I think there's a piece, and again, this was very clearly, I think, brought out by the presentation from Lloyds Banking Group, is, there is a real piece around confidence in this space, because a lot of those decisions do need to be made outside of policy when the computer does say no. I loved Anita's description of that, because that's how I used to describe things as well. And certainly, it's really important that banks start working with each other to understand what each other is doing. Because obviously this is a regulated area. So the more that we can demonstrate that these decisions can be made and should be made, and what the impact is of making them, we would really hope that more banks and building societies do more. But what I would also say is, the Code of Practice did create a very new way of working. And certainly, again, the evaluation showed that it is going to take time, to roll out and embed. And certainly, a lot of firms that we worked with, spent the first year doing that properly. And we're just kind of starting to see them kind of go above and beyond those principles now. So, yeah, I think going forward, certainly more banks and building societies and other financial industry institutions will join this work. But at the very least, there's at least 24 of the main banks and building societies, and certainly Lloyds Banking Group, 1 in 4 of the population bank with them. So what I would encourage anybody to do actually is to look at the brands that sit under these groups. So Lloyds Banking Group, NatWest Group, they do cover a variety of different brands, and hopefully we'll be reaching the majority of the population.
Thank you so much. Okay, and we've got a couple other questions coming in. So to the other panelists, looking at when companies and banks and building societies are really wanting to start this work, do you have any initial tips on how they might get to grips with economic abuse as an issue and some of the key things they need to understand?
I think, well, obviously I would say this because this is what we did with NatWest. I would say talk to a specialist organisation who can support you, and SEA is right at the heart of all of that work. So I would say definitely talk to them. And I think both Lloyds and NatWest talked about this, the importance of engaging your whole organisation, work out where you're going to start with that work, and then make sure that you're having the conversations across the business. And at the most senior levels, at NatWest, it's very clear that Alison Frost is absolutely 120% behind this work. And once the big boss says yes to something or is committed to something, that gives weight to all the very good work that's going on already, no doubt, across various different bits of an organisation. So I would say be clear about the issue, gather evidence from your colleagues and from survivors if people are talking to you about this. So you've got a bit of a weight of an evidence base to say, look, this is an issue we've got to do something about, and then try and escalate it as far up your organisation as possible to say, look, this really matters. And God knows we can see today from the comments in the chat, the real immediacy and hideousness of this issue for so many people, and it shouldn't have to be that way. We've heard lots of good examples today of organisations who've gripped this and are trying to do things differently.
Thanks, Liz. And Ellie, is there any learning from your work with the co-op that other firms might be able to take from?
I think I'd really agree with what Nicola and Liz have said, really. I think there increasingly are lots of resources and information and research out there. There's the work that Refuge and SafeLives, and particularly Surviving Economic Abuse, have done. So I would gather that evidence. I think I would, as far as possible, speak to your customers that have disclosed to you about their experiences of that and what they need, of course, and boundaries of that being done sensitively and safely. And buy-in is really key. I'd say buy-in from senior people at the bank, but also the bank's customers is really important. I know that's something that the Cooperative Bank has done a lot of, communicating to their customers about why they do this work, and really embedding that into their sort of customer donation kind of portals that they have, and giving by their customers to make it a real organisational wide commitment to this area.
Thanks, Ellie. And some of the, just trying to summarize some of the other questions that are coming in. So we've heard about the great work that's going on. There seems to be a lot happening in this space, but looking forward to next year, are there some gaps in the system that we feel need to be plugged? And is there anything that you'd particularly like to see banks and building societies looking to do more on in the next year? Maybe I could start with Nicola on that one.
Thanks, Christina. I mean, again, I think Anita was really powerful from Lloyds Banking Group in talking about how we're learning every day. And that's one of the really exciting parts of the partnership, is that we are very aware of the needs of victims and survivors. And so we can start to respond to those needs going forward. Certainly something that we've all spoken today about is the issue of coerced debt. Similarly, our research shows that 60% of domestic abuse victims will be coerced into debt, with an average debt from our findings slightly higher at £4,500. 45% of that debt is priority debt. So again, as Ellie mentioned, people are at risk of homelessness, of having their utilities cut off. This is a massive, massive issue. So something that we are very keen, and again, it's great hearing from Holly from NatWest Group, talking about the review they're doing into coerced debt at the moment, knowing that this is a focus of the cooperative bank with Refuge as well, but also something, again, that Jen spoke to very powerfully. So that's one area that we can see would make a huge difference going forward. And I did make mention of the economic abuse evidence form, as again highlighted by yourself, Christina. We're all going to be working in a coordinated way with SafeLives and Refuge represented on the steering group, which will see that piece of work going forward. So, hopefully creating an economic abuse evidence form which consistently presents evidence to creditors. Again, our experience so far in partnership with Money Advice Plus suggests that 1 in 4 of our approaches to a creditor, asking them to write off coerced debt as a goodwill gesture, is successful, but that still leaves 3 out of 4 requests that aren't successful. And certainly, again, it points back to the need to work across industry, which again, Jane and Anita did talk to. Because certainly, if 3 out of 4 or even 4 out of the 5 of the creditors that we know on average victims and survivors are in contact with are writing off that debt, but actually one refuses to do so, or perhaps doesn't want to remove a default notice from a credit report, groups can do an amazing piece of work, but if one group doesn't, then the victim survivor, isn't going to be able to move forward in the way that we would like to. So I think, addressing the issue of coerced debt, making sure that we have some really good industry-wide practice is really important. Obviously, Ellie and Liz will speak, but I feel a bit of a fraud today, if I'm honest, because it's now Christina and Jen as surviving economic abuse, who are working on this issue day in, day out. They hold so much more knowledge and expertise than me, Christina. So I also just encourage you, even though you are chair, please do add to my answer.
No, absolutely. I think for me, coerced debt and that consistency piece is really, really important. I think, when we hear from victim survivors, they might have had an incredible experience with one lender, but they are still being, unfortunately not having such a great experience with someone else. And, you can have the best experience in the world, but it's the negative one that someone will remember and take forward with them. So it's really important to get that consistency. Ellie, is there anything you'd like to add to that one?
It's all a bit repetitive, I'm afraid, but I totally agree with you that coerced debt is this number one issue that we need to focus on. And I suppose linked to that is some of the findings around online banking that came from the cooperative bank work. And at Refuge, we have a specialist tech abuse and economic abuse team that are doing lots of work around the ways in which technology can be used to perpetrate and facilitate abuse. And there's a link there that as more and more things happen that make lives easier for most people, they can do everything on their phone. They don't have to go and speak to somebody. Processes are streamlined. Obviously, for survivors, that can be really, really dangerous and make it really easy for them to be controlled, monitored, overdrafts to be taken out, expensive phone contracts to be taken out really simply. And that, of course, contributes to these coerced debt problems that we're all talking about. So I think just to add a sort of tech abuse angle to coerced debt, but I absolutely agree, it's the key issue.
Thanks, Ellie. And Liz, anything you'd add?
I think just, well, to echo everything that everybody has said, really, those things are really important. But I think also, as I alluded to, awareness, public awareness of this issue is really key. The bill provides a great opportunity to highlight that, but so do all of you. If any of you are here from financial institutions, it's great to hear about organisations who are ahead of the game, like Lloyds and NatWest, with this work. But don't be the last one on the bus, because actually, when you do get on the bus, what you will discover is that all your staff are behind you. I think that's been the thing that's most striking about all the training we've done with employers, an area of work that we've been struggling to get into for a long time. But in the last 9 months, huge numbers of employers coming to us saying, what do we do? How do we support our staff? Because that pressure is coming from people themselves, from your employees. They care about this issue because they know someone that it's happened to. So I think just thinking today about what action you yourselves can take in your individual spheres of influence is probably the most powerful thing. The more people we tell about it, the more it raises up the issue as something to be challenged and changed.
Absolutely. Thank you, Liz. And yeah, one thing I think that I've definitely taken from the work is that you know, banks are these huge institutions with, you know, sometimes 80 to 100,000 people who work within them. But it's having those champions, and you might be someone on this call today who's heard this, who really wants to take this issue forward. And, you know, having those champions within an institution can slowly lead to institutional wide change. And so it's really important that, you know, if you are interested in this subject, please do stay connected to this issue. A lot more work will be going on this year.
Can I just interject there to say, I have another 3 months worth of Home Office funding to support this work. And it is freely available, our training. So if you are a bank, building society, financial institution who would like some training, do book us in quickly.
Absolutely. I am going to pause the panel there if that's okay, but an absolutely huge thank you to Ellie, Liz and Nicola today for answering the questions from the audience, and also thank you to all our other speakers today for your time and for, you know, being part of this session today. It has been hugely interesting. I've learned a lot as someone who's worked in this space. It's always learning. So just to summarize for the end of today, so just sort of summarizing, as we know, as I said earlier, that lack of economic security and access to resources are the primary reasons that women return to an abusive partner. So all of this work that banks and building societies are doing is rebuilding that economic security and that economic stability for victim survivors going forward. So just to make you aware, if you've been listening to this webinar today and you would like some support, or you would like to support someone else, we have nearly 30 resources on our website for victims and survivors. Everything from how to separate your finances, how the bank can support you with an overview of kind of what we've talked through today, how to use the code of practice to advocate for your rights and your needs. We also have a range of resources for professionals, including for those who work as part of banks and building societies. So we developed a resource during the COVID outbreak, so supporting customers during coronavirus as part of a bank. But we also have a conversation kit developed for banks, which can guide frontline professionals on some of the questions to ask to victim survivors in order to get a real understanding of the issue. And, you know, as Nicola said, we are funded by the Home Office to provide refresher training and also new training to banks and building societies. So if that's something you're listening to today and that might be helpful for you, please do get in touch with Surviving Economic Abuse. The contact details will be available on our website, which is www.survivingeconomicabuse.org. So just as a final thing, thank you so much to everyone who's participated in this webinar today. It's been fascinating to have so many speakers from both the financial services world and the domestic abuse world, and also hear, you know, from Dr. Olamide Adisa about our report findings, hear about the work that Jen's been doing from Surviving Economic Abuse to Lloyds. So hopefully you've got a real snapshot of what we've been up to. We have some further webinars coming in our series, COVID-19, a rapid review and insight into the experiences of victim survivors during COVID will be on tomorrow. Please do visit our website to sign up for that. We also have webinars on the work we've been doing with the police, and also work around children and economic abuse coming up in the series. So hopefully you can join us for those. And finally, I know we're just at the time, so thank you so much for staying on, everyone. We really appreciate your support, and hopefully you can follow the work in this space as we move into 2021. Big thank you to our speakers, and a special thank you to Natalie today for sharing her experience with us all. Thank you and have a good day.